Welcome everyone. We are broadcasting today from Edinburgh, across 4 locations in Edinburgh. Everyone is at home. I don't appear to be at home. I have chosen for my background an image from one of our previous events from 2018, but it doesn't matter. We always have this screen, just with different, with our logo. And had there not been COVID, I suppose we would be seeing each other in person now in Informatics Forum, where we were planning to hold the event this year as well. And so a little bit of a reminder that hopefully we'll see each other in person as well. So just a little bit of maybe a context and technical housekeeping. So as I mentioned, we are broadcasting from Edinburgh, and this is our first webinar, first as Bilingualism Matters in Edinburgh. So please bear with us if there are any technical glitches. You might have seen Antonella or Thomas on different platforms, but as I mentioned, this is our first one as an organization, so we're still learning. As I mentioned, the technical housekeeping, the session is being recorded, and so we've asked you whether that was an issue. Some people had, but I think there is no visibility of attendees. The attendees are not being recorded. Also, if you ask questions and you don't want your name to appear, you just have to put it as an anonymous question. There will be polls as well. They are also anonymous, and so I suppose there won't be any trace of attendees if the attendee chooses not to be visible, so to say. We will share this video afterwards. If the recording has good quality, we will try to add a BSL translation and share it with the BSL community as well. As a webinar attendee, you are not enabled to neither speak nor be seen, but you can interact with us via the Q&A session. And there's if you basically touch your screen on the bottom, there should be a Q&A icon, and when you press, you can ask questions to specific panelists or to all panelists, and the questions will be answered at the end of the session. So you can ask questions anytime, but they will all be answered when the talks finish at the end. There's also a chat area, and you've seen already perhaps Christy has been putting links to our website, and if there's anything you would like to share with the whole community that is relevant, or just say hi, just use the chat area. Okay, I think that's everything from the technical side. The seminar is meant to last 1 hour. We have 2 panelists. They are both very experienced speakers, and we're delighted to have them. So just for your reference, we are all affiliated with Bilingualism Matters Edinburgh. So let's start from the most senior person, Antonella Sorace, Professor Antonella Sorace, the founder of Bilingualism Matters almost 11 years ago, Antonella, I suppose. And Antonella is a professor of the developmental linguistics on top of various other things that she does, or perhaps primarily. And Dr. Thomas Bak, who has been with Bilingualism Matters for several years, and he is a reader in cognitive neuroscience, human cognitive neuroscience. And he also is a program director for bilingualism in later life, aging and dementia. They will be, there's also Christy Brewster, and Christy Brewster will be managing the Q&A today, and she, as well as myself, my name is Katarzyna Przybicin, or Kat Przybicin, as many people know me. We both work for Bilingualism Matters. Right, so I think we're going to start with the first talk. It will be Antonella talking about languages in lockdown and beyond. And Antonella, without further ado, I suppose over to you.
Can you hear me? Can you see the screen? Okay. Well, hello to everybody, and thanks for joining us. I think that it's fair to say that we live in an unprecedented situation, because in most people's living memory, no crisis has caused so much upheaval so broadly and so quickly as the current pandemic. We've all experienced a situation of lockdown. Many of us are now, the lockdown restrictions have been released gradually, more gradually in some places than in others. But clearly the lockdown situation has created challenges for everybody, but we're going to focus on the challenges for bilingual families, multilingual families. Sorry, just yes, and I think it's fair to say that the challenges are compounded by social inequality. So the loss of nearly 4 months of education will have an impact on all children, but some will be worse affected than others. Because some children received one-to-one parental support, for example, but others couldn't do that and struggled to continue learning at home. We also know that a good number of children don't have access to a broadband connection, or they can't connect to internet at home. And many children don't have a quiet room where they can study at home, particularly in low-income households. So we're all aware of these inequality constraints. But the message that I want to give you today is that, as the proverb says, all clouds have a silver lining. So we can try to turn the temporary disadvantages of the current situation into longer-term benefits for multilingual families. So what does it mean? What has the lockdown meant for families that are coming out of it? And what does it mean for families that are still in it? And let's not forget that it may happen again. We all very much hope that it won't. But I think, it's useful to see what we can learn from a situation like this. So lockdown means or meant more time spent with the whole family. So all family members are together in the same space for a much longer period of time. And that means more use of home languages for bilingual and multilingual families. It also means less use of the majority language, the language of the community, and typically the language of schooling. Typically it's the same language. And that also means challenges of homeschooling. So schools are closed, families have received instructions to do homeschooling. And many families find themselves doing homeschooling in a language that is not their own. So in a second language rather than in their home language. So how can we turn this into an opportunity for home languages and for bilingualism? I think it's useful to give you a little bit of research backgrounds. I don't have time to go into details, but just to say that having more than one language in the family can give children potential linguistic and cognitive advantages. So what am I talking about? So from a language point of view, bilingual children tend to understand how language works in a spontaneous way better than monolingual children. And they do it because their brain spontaneously compares more than one language. Having more than one language can give potential inroads into early literacy, particularly learning to read, but also a potential better understanding of the structure of the majority language. And this is what worries many parents and teachers. So can a child who has another language at home do equally well in the language of schooling, which is typically the majority language of the community? And the answer is yes. I mean, obviously if they get enough exposure to the majority language and the language of schooling. From a cognitive point of view, so outside the language domain, we know that bilingual children have a better understanding that it is possible to have a different point of view. So they are more aware that there are different points of view and different perspectives, and they are more ready to embrace other people's perspectives. And they can also, they can be better at paying focused attention and adapt to changing circumstances. So for example, switching between one task and another. So the main message is that it doesn't matter which languages we're talking about, it's the fact of having more than one language that matters. And not whether you speak a prestigious language or a non-prestigious language. So there are no more useful or less useful languages from this point of view. So that doesn't mean that there aren't any challenges for families, because bilingual children, in order to get these benefits, must hear enough languages enough of the time. So they must have enough interactive, engaging exposure to both languages. So that means not sitting in front of a TV, because that is not interactive exposure. And that also means hearing the language from different speakers. So people who speak the language in different ways, which is normal. So having even a mini community around that is very helpful for bilingual children. And having positive attitudes around. So children are very sensitive to what people think about their languages and about their being bilingual in those languages. So positive attitudes are absolutely crucial in order to benefit from the effects of bilingualism that I mentioned before. So in the current situation, many parents actually wonder or have wondered whether they should stop speaking their home language. And the answer is no, they should not stop speaking their home language. First of all, because that affects their family communication. If the family communication, the expression of emotions, the expression of what matters for the family happens in the home language, that is absolutely crucial. But also because maintaining the home language maintains and gives children the potential benefits of bilingualism. So absolutely, you know, there's no reason to stop speaking the home language. And speaking and using the home language, yes, but particularly now that we all can, in the home with the whole family. So speaking the home language, reading, playing, using the home language within the whole family in an interactive way, in a way that engages children, that is absolutely crucial. Sometimes we hear the situation where there is a partner who doesn't speak the language as a native speaker, and these partners, you know, may not participate in family life very often because they work, you know, usually they don't spend enough time with the family. Now it's the time for these non-native speaking parents to actually participate in the language of the family. And similarly, older siblings, you know, there may be older siblings who feel more comfortable in English now, or whatever the home language is, the community language is, the language of schooling. But now they find themselves in the home situation with the whole family, and that's the right time to go back to the home language and start, you know, using it again together with the family. And that means also having frequent online chats with grandparents or family members who don't live at home for a variety of situations. So those are all wonderful opportunities to keep speaking the home language in an engaging way, in a way that actually fosters the child's engagement. Now, reading in the home language, yes, I mean, I would like to remind people how important what reading in the home language means, because reading in one language can actually benefit reading in other languages. So there is transfer of skills from one language to the other. For example, understanding that a printed word keeps the same meaning wherever it appears. So if you see horse, it means horse, you think of a horse, no matter where, you know, the word horse appears next to a dog, for example, or next to a horse. So that kind of awareness comes from learning to read in any language. And for alphabetic language, languages, so languages like English or Italian or languages that use an alphabet as a writing system, understanding that there are correspondences between letters and sounds is crucial. And so doing it in one language actually benefits reading in another language. So reading in the home language, yes, it can help continuing and improving reading in the language of schooling as well. Will my child forget English? And we get this question, you know, sometimes, you know, they haven't been at school, they haven't really been taught in English. Does it mean that they're going to do worse at school when they go back to school? Well, let's remind ourselves that the perfect bilingual doesn't exist. So fluency levels change over time in all bilinguals. So that means that right now the home language is blossoming, and children may be, you know, more comfortable in the home language. But when they go back to school, they will quickly readjust to English. And that's normal in all bilinguals. We don't expect bilinguals to behave like two monolinguals in one. And fluency level change over time. So it's all right for now to be more fluent in the home language. That will change in due course. Can I do homeschooling in my non-native language? Yes, you can, even if you don't feel very comfortable in the language of schooling because it's not your native language. And many parents worry that they might actually affect their child's English or whatever the main language of schooling is. Let's remind ourselves that children don't automatically learn mistakes, mispronunciation, particularly if they hear the language from different sources. So there's no danger that our children can, you know, speak the community language less well because they are being taught by us as non-native speakers of the language. And let's also remember that speaking both languages, so trans languages, can be very good. So you don't have to stick to the non-native language. You can also, you know, move back and forth in and out of your home language. And that is also good for homeschooling. And finally, homeschooling in immersion programs in a different language. So I'm thinking, for example, of Gaelic medium education schools in the UK, in the Scottish environment. How can you help your child? How can you do homeschooling? Well, you make all sources of input available to your child, first of all, but I would suggest also grab the opportunity and start learning the language. Get your children involved. In many cases, what we see is that children can be wonderful teachers. So it makes them feel really important. It makes them feel that they do know better than we do in these languages. And so get them involved, you know, learn from your children and get the opportunity to start learning a new language, which is always useful at any age in life. And making children proud of their languages, this is part of the whole situation. So children's positive attitudes and positive perception of their languages is actually vital to bilingualism in any minority language. So making your child feeling really proud and really good with speaking the home language or the home languages is very, very important, and it benefits their future performance in English or in whatever the community language is. So to go back to what we were saying at the beginning, all clouds have a silver lining. So let's turn the temporary disadvantages of lockdown, of this crazy situation that we are living, into longer term benefits for multilingual families and for bilingual and multilingual societies. Let's celebrate languages. So let's compensate for the temporary disadvantages with increasing the value of home languages. And we are here to help. Bilingualism Matters does precisely this. It tries to get involved with many sectors of societies, including families, including schools, including health professionals and other sectors. And you can always, we are here to help. You can always get in touch with us and ask us questions, and we'll try to help as much as we can. And this is the ways to get in touch with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonella. As I mentioned before, we're not going to take questions now, but you're welcome to put the questions in the question and answer area. And Thomas, you are started sharing yet, but I would like to use the opportunity for between the presentations to just ask the audience a few questions, and they are related to Antonella's talk. So you will see the polling coming up, and if you could just answer, that would be fantastic. So let's start with yourselves, and the question is, well, see the questions for yourselves, but there's two questions about whether you speak one language, well, more than one language, and the other one is, do you consider yourself bilingual? So please answer the questions now. Fantastic, almost everyone has now responded. So I'm just going to show you the results of the poll as well. We've got a very multilingual community joining our seminar today. That's fantastic. And most of them consider themselves bio or multilinguals, which is also very good. Antonella did not refer to this particular aspect of who is a bilingual, but I think Thomas will as well. So that's good. Now we have one more question to you, and they relate to Antonella's topic again. And the questions are, did you have to homeschool your children in a language that you're not confident in? That's the first question. The other one is, did you feel that your children were using more home language? And the third question is, if you are perhaps working in a school environment, and it's the question about the languages of schooling. If you could take a minute and respond to those questions, it would be fantastic. So perhaps 10 seconds more and we'll close the poll. Brilliant. So there's not everyone, but I suppose perhaps there's a few people still left. Perhaps they don't want to vote, in which case just going to close the poll now. Fantastic. And you can see the results here as well. So I suppose there's quite a few teachers amongst us, as 1/4 of the audience was worried about the pupils' language skills, and very interesting results as well. Right. I'm going to stop sharing at the moment, and I'm going to pass on to Thomas Bak, and for him to run his presentation.
Okay, so can everybody see the screen and listen to me? Okay. So one moment, there's just no feedback.
You are being seen, and we see your presentation stomachs. So.
Okay, perfect. So then I start. Okay, so my talk has kind of more indirectly to do with COVID, because I think one of the problems, apart from lockdown, which this COVID crisis has made even more acute, is what is a kind of information we can trust? You can find a lot of information, I mean, bombarding us, I mean, from, you know, I would say very serious to different conspiration theories and so on and so on. And the question always arises, what are the sources of information that we can trust? And that is something which I want to kind of approach in my talk in relation to bilingualism. Now, just to start, I put my Twitter handle. So if you take any pictures, you are welcome to take pictures of the screen and you are welcome to tweet them, but please tag me in so then I know and can kind of retweet it again. Okay, so just to give you a very quick history of bilingualism research in one slide over the last 200 years, I would say that for most of the human history, I mean, bilingualism was something very normal. And in fact, in educated circles, it was recognized that it's something which is not just normal, which is necessary. I mean, there's a beautiful citation of Goethe, in fact, published in his posthum work 1 year after his death, that who doesn't know foreign languages knows nothing about his own, which in a way modern research would very much support with the idea of what we call now metalinguistic knowledge. But then in 20th century, there was also a very, I would say, bilingualism hostile narrative, assuming that bilingualism really destroys people, particularly children's intelligence. And the kind of classical study would be here in 1923, where Serre claimed that kids who speak English and Welsh are underperforming, and that's because their brain is completely confused with these two languages. Now, a big shift of the pendulum in the other direction came in 1962, where a study in Montreal started to look whether there is really such a disadvantage in bilingual children, and found, to their surprise, exactly the opposite. If anything, if we practically control for socioeconomic status, bilingual kids were better. And I would say it followed about 50 years of research showing more and more benefits, which Antonella also referred to in her talk. And I would say kind of nice paper I would just pick out, I mean, I could say 100, is 2009, where Białystok wrote about specific effects. Now, it's very, very important. Bilingualism has been shown to have specific effects, some of them positive, some of them negative, although not many, very, very few, and some indifference. So it's not that bilingualism makes you generally brilliant and intelligent and so on. It has very, very specific effects, and that will become relevant in 2 slides time. And then I would say the kind of thing turned a little bit, 2013 with a paper by Papp, who was claiming that bilingualism effects don't exist. And since then, I would say there's a certain fashion of papers which kind of come with sweeping statements, there is no effect whatsoever, it doesn't really matter. So that's a kind of quick story. And by late, so to say, by 2015, 2016, there was almost a fashion of having bilingualism debates. So for instance, one was Society of Neuroscience in London, Neurobiology of Language, where Ellen Białystok, whom I mentioned, had a debate with Manolo Carreras. Then in September of the same year, I had a debate with Papp, whom I just mentioned, in Ghent, in Belgium. And then there was another debate I had, in April following year with Manolo Carreras in Akasalompolo in Finland. Now, this debate reminded me a little bit. Now, people from Scotland will recognize probably the pictures below. This is a famous old firm game between Glasgow clubs, Rangers and Celtic. And it's a little bit, it almost became like a sport, which side will win. And I remember in Akasalompolo, the first evening I arrived there and people didn't know me. And one of the guys says, "Oh, so are you for or against bilingualism?" And I thought, well, maybe it's not just the right way of approaching the question. And I think, to give you a wonderful example how not to do it, I have a paper here. I mean, I don't want to mention the authors because it's not about the author, it's about a certain attitude. But very recently, a few weeks ago, a paper went kind of through social media, and there were a lot of reports, blogs, with the title, "Bilingualism Affords No General Cognitive Advantages." So firstly, as I try to stress, no one ever claimed that there were general advantages, only very, very specific ones. And then in a population study of executive function in 11,000 people. Now, that sounds amazing, doesn't it? 11,000. Must be true. Well, let's look what this paper really does. And the first thing is, and that is something which already was mentioned in the talk of Antonella, and that's something which I think is a very crucial question here. Who is bilingual? You can see in this box, they ask people what languages do they primarily speak at home, and a wonderful question, how many languages do you speak? I will have the next slide about it. I would say it's a kind of pub quiz type question rather than a scientific research. By the way, not only language questions were mapped. So for instance, economic status was looked. When you were growing up, were you at or above the poverty level or below poverty level? Now, the second thing is representativity. So a very interesting sentence here. Finally, participants from some countries, like Portugal, were much more likely to be bilingual, and so the match sample were constructed from individuals only in Canada, US, UK, and Australia. So basically, you take out countries where bilingualism is, in fact, perceived as something normal. That's something very important as well. And the third thing is, I stress always, and I will come to it later, the specificity. So how was executive function evaluated? Well, 12 tests, one of which was grammatical reasoning. Now remember, these are people, you compare monolingual English speakers with maybe some immigrants who learned English as their second, third, or fourth language. So surprisingly, English native speaker might have an advantage in doing grammatical reasoning in English. Well, that doesn't come as a surprise, does it? Okay, so let me come to the main question. So what does it mean to speak a language? Well, does it mean you have to sound like a native? Or does it mean you are able to order a beer? Or does it mean you are able to hold an everyday conversation? Or be able to discuss a life-threatening diagnosis with a doctor if you need to? Or feel comfortable expressing your or sharing your emotions? Now, those of you who are bilingual might notice, by the way, that there might be a different answer to different questions. So we might feel, for instance, much better discussing precise intellectual topics in one language, but for instance, emotional in the other. That would be the case for me. And is it about current or past use? So if we grew up speaking a language and then for the last 20 years we hardly used it, is it still, so to say, the language that we should note or not? So in a way, you notice it's very difficult, in fact, to say what it means to be a bilingual. And if we look at the studies, we will find that on the one hand, the comparison of mono and bilinguals is very problematic because very often you can have people coming from two groups. So for instance, if you take out all the countries in which bilingualism is normal, so you take the classical immigration countries, and that's exactly what authors have done here, then you have association between immigration and bilingualism. And by the way, it can go in both directions. So on the one hand, you can say that there is so-called the immigrant advantage, the immigrant strength. So they are the strongest of their community who have left, survived the immigration, settled in the new country. On the other hand, they are very often in a disadvantageous position in terms of economic situation, education, and so on and so on. So we are not really comparing like with like. Education prestige. There is something which I find very interesting, which I call the sandwich model of bilingualism. In many societies, not just in Western ones, you will find that the bilingualism is most prevalent at the upper and the lower edges of society, with the middle being monolingual. It's certainly the case, for instance, in, let's say, in UK, where you will have the kind of the posh people who, you know, used to learn French, now are probably learning Chinese. And then you have all the immigrant languages, which have a lower prestige. And then you have the monolingual middle. But as I say, I will come in a moment to Bolivia. There you would have also the Western languages at the upper end, and let's say the Aboriginal languages like Quechua, Aymara, Guarani, and so on at the lower. And then you have the question of reverse causality. I will come to it in a moment. But the second is, it's not just about apple and oranges, it's that the apples are very different. So within the bilinguals, there are a lot of important variables: age of acquisition, proficiency, patterns of use. So I would say over the last 10 years, probably, a lot of focus has moved from just looking how proficient people are to looking how much, so to say, how they use the language, including code switching, which for a long time was frowned upon and now is seen as, in fact, something which can produce very positive cognitive effects. Let me now give you a kind of very quick metaphor which explains the importance of the place. Imagine you are doing a study in Edinburgh which finds that water boils at 100 degrees, and then you want to find out whether it's universal. So you consult your colleagues in Amsterdam, in New York, San Francisco, and Shanghai. All of them tell you the same. Does it mean we have a universal law? It seems so. And then imagine that there is a paper coming from La Paz saying, oh no, I think it's 92 degrees. You would be very inclined to say, this might be wrong. Maybe they don't have good measurements, or they did something wrong, and so on and so on. And then maybe you will find that also Addis Ababa and Lhasa have different results. Now you notice already what I am after. The boiling temperature of water depends on the altitude. Now, if something as basic as boiling temperature of water, a relatively straightforward physical fact, depends so much on the place, how do we want to believe that bilingualism will be exactly the same everywhere across the world? And that is exactly the paper which I entitled Cooking Pasta in La Paz, looking at these different effects. And the lessons are, one is a large N alone, so a large number, does not make a funding universal. So if you have a study with 11,000 people, like the one I mentioned, if they didn't assess properly bilingualism, the study is worthless. It would not be better if they have 100,000 of people, because at the end of the day, we have no clue what their bilingualism status was. And having 100 studies doesn't really invalidate one single if it's looking at a different effect. And that is a big problem in another genre which we are being bombarded with. And these are systematic reviews and meta-analysis. It is believed when we put all studies together, then we will get something true. Well, it depends. You are looking at available studies, and in order to have representative data, you need to know all the potential contributing factors. And I don't think it would be a very modest assumption that we can ever know that. So let me summarize in a few slides. So why do studies produce different results? Well, naturally they do. Firstly, you have different type of bilingualism and also monolingualism. Monolinguals are not that easy to find in many countries, maybe in Britain easier than others. You have different associated interacting variables, as I was mentioning. Then you have task specificity, so it's not all task, and level of difficulty. You have a task so easy that everybody does it, or so difficult that no one can do it, then you will find no difference between groups. Language of instruction plays a role as well. So here we had, for instance, in the study I mentioned, people who very often spoke English as a second, third, fourth language, but tested in English. Then you have the issue of reverse causality. So is it learning languages that makes people clever, or is it being clever make you more likely to learn languages? A very interesting topic. I have two papers which dealt exactly with this issue. And then the question how you interpret the results. Let me also focus on one topic, because that's particularly of importance for me, and that is dementia. There are also big debates about dementia studies. Does bilingualism delay the onset or not? Well, the first thing is, it's age of onset rather than incidence. So it's not that it prevents dementia, that you will never get it. It's that you will get it later, probably about 4 years. 4 years is a big result, but very often it is interpreted wrongly, saying it prevents it. It depends on diagnosis of dementia. So Alzheimer or frontotemporal dementia might be affected differently. And here the age threshold comes in. If you look, for instance, only of people above 65, then you miss a lot of FTD cases because they very often manifest before 65. Language of assessment. So very often you will find studies that look, for instance, a dementia patient in Hispanic population in the US, but using English as the only testing method. So again, you are putting people at disadvantage, possibly testing them in a language which they are less confident in. And then you have a paradox of atrophy, which is very complex. I am happy to kind of come to it in the discussion. So let me now, I think that's my penultimate slide, summarize what are the common prejudices against bilingualism. Because I would say, if you look at all the situation, it's so logical for me that I would expect to have different results. I would be surprised if all studies would be showing the same. I mean, that would be very unnatural. That doesn't happen in any other area. For instance, if we look at the effect of education on, let's say, dementia, cognitive aging, and so on, why should bilingualism be an exception? So I think there are probably a lot of different reasons why people find it difficult to accept the kind of bilingual advantages. One is the idea, I put it as bilingualism versus Google, is just waste of time, effort, money, brain space. And very often this is based in a model of brain like a chest of drawers. You put things in and then basically putting an additional language is taking away space for other things. But we know brain is not a chest of drawers, it's a network. So putting another layer in fact reinforces the information you have, and that could be the explanation for the things that Antonella mentioned. For instance, teaching people to read in a second language improves the reading in the first. So from this point of view, and vice versa. So the things reinforce each other because they interact. So this is a very, I would say, a relatively outdated idea of, so to say, chest of drawers model of language. And we describe it in this paper, 2017. Many people fear bilingualism must be confusing, particularly interesting, they're almost always monolinguals. And then let's not forget there is also a political dimension. I mean, I have these three pictures here to kind of illustrate it. I don't know if anybody recognizes the flag. It's from Friesland. I noticed looking through international literature after I published a paper about stroke and bilingualism, that there was an article how good news it is for Frisian people because now they are proud of the language and they will have less strokes. Not quite, so I think well meant, not quite exactly how my study meant it. Jeb Bush here, he was criticized in US during the last presidential campaign for his ability to speak Spanish. And here, I mean, the flower is, many of you might have heard, very recent news in Britain, where, for instance, a family was forbidden in Coventry to put an inscription in Irish on the grave of their deceased relative because it was considered as a political provocation to use Irish as a language. So let me come to my last slide. I think if we really want to approach this topic, we need to embrace the complexity. There's a beautiful citation. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And I think that's what we see in a lot of papers. And I would say it's almost, look at the papers, look at your emails. If you get an email that offers you, 10 million, just if you give all the details of your account, probably will not answer it. If you find a paper that claims to have solved the problem, you can be almost sure that it's not really profound. Bilingualism interacts with a myriad of variables, but that's exactly what makes it such a fascinating topic to study. And I finish with my Twitter account as well. I tweet a lot, and in the next few days, I will be also tweeting references, links to all the papers that I mentioned in the talk today. So thank you very much, and I hope we'll still have some discussion.
Thank you, Thomas. If you could stop sharing, that'd be fantastic. And now is the time for everyone to think about a question that you might have. We have one question there already. We're gonna ask all panelists to now appear on the screen. And I suppose we start with the first question, and if someone would like to type in a question again, you're welcome to do it now. Christy, what is the question?
Well, we have one question at the moment that came in while Antonella was talking, so she did answer some of it, but we'll probably want to expand on it. It's from Faye McDermott, and she says, parents of children who attend Gaelic medium education are in the majority not fluent in Gaelic and are worried that their children are losing their Gaelic language skills. What can they do to keep their children engaged in Gaelic?
Right, as I said before, that is not an easy situation if you don't speak the language at all. You can try to get into it and engage with your children that way. Make them feel, learn from them because they know the language better than you. And then if there are resources, and for many minority languages, for Gaelic, for example, there are resources that can be used. There could be always more resources. And this is a study that we did recently with students in Gaelic medium education in high school, and we looked at new speakers of Gaelic as well as home speakers of Gaelic, and we found that, you know, their Gaelic was perfect. I mean, there was really, you know, no difference between home and new speakers of Gaelic, but the engagement with the language actually was different, particularly for new speakers. The engagement with Gaelic, you know, in their teenage years was not very high. So what really mattered in their lives was more in English. And so English was the cooler language. What can we do about that? Well, you know, create more resources, make sure that Gaelic as well as other minority languages really become part of children's lives in a more important way.
Great, thank you. We have another question that's come in from Vanessa. Either of you or both of you could answer. Is multilingualism associated with better cognitive performance than bilingualism? So I guess if more than two languages has any kind of difference than just two languages.
Well, it's a very complex question, in fact, and we have a lot of conflicting evidence. So there are some studies that show more effects as the languages go up. There are some studies that show a border at 2, some studies which show effect only from 3 languages onward. Now, I would say from my experience that probably there is a relationship, but it's not a linear one. So there is more difference between 1 and 2 than between 2 and 3, 3 and 4, and so on. So the curve gets slightly flatter, and probably from 5, 6 onwards, it won't really make such an additional effect. And in some way, I would say this is also parallel to the ease of learning. I mean, those of us who kind of try to, you know, speak many languages, and by the way, one of the reasons why I found the question, you know, how many languages do you speak, so difficult, because I don't know what I would say. Probably depend on how many beers I have in a pub. So it could be 4 I use generally, or 7 I use, so to say, in my lectures. But I would say from a kind of, you know, 4th, 5th onward, it's much, much easier, because then you can compare, you kind of get it much easier. So from this point of view, there is a relationship, but it's not a line.
Great, thanks, Thomas. Would you like to add anything, Antonella?
I would just like to, summarize basically, you know, the bottom line is that at the moment, the biggest differences are between knowing one language and more than one. The differences between 2 and 3 or 3 and 4 are less clear, but the difference between 1 and more than 1 is clear.
Great. We've got another one coming in. This one is from Adriana Uribe. I work teaching ESOL to new Scots, and during this period, they are not actively practicing their newly gained English language skills. While children are facing the difficulties of homeschooling, I'm assuming that perhaps my adult students would have regressed in their language learning process. Will already bilingual adults have an actual advantage in recovering their recently learned English?
Meaning compared to children, bilingual adults? I think that the level, as I said, bilingualism varies, you know, the level of competence in both languages actually changes depending on exposure, depending on circumstances, and so on. So if now it's a circumstance in which English is heard less, and therefore, you know, proficiency in other languages gets better, and then the situation changes, the relative level of competence will change too. And I think we shouldn't worry too much about the effects of hearing a language less right now, in anticipation that future changes may change the levels of proficiency once again.
Thank you. I think maybe the angle she was coming at was maybe if they are already bilingual, so if they already speak 2 or 3 languages and they're learning English, will they have an advantage over people that are learning English as their first foreign language? Does that make sense? Their first, second language? Yeah,
they might. I mean, there's no clear evidence, you know, but it might be that being multilingual, you know, helps in this sense as well. But we don't have any hard evidence, you know, to show that.
Okay, the next one is from Angela. She's found that through bilingual story and songs shared within a setting with parents, it's proving a great support and success in speaking several languages. Is there any kind of research about that in terms of backing that up, that storytelling and song sharing is good in supporting home languages?
I would say yes. I mean, there is research that the more resources, the more the language is actually engaging for children and for speakers, the better from the point of view of learning. So, you know, children can learn, obviously, you know, their brain can learn, but we have evidence that if the engagement is not there, if the motivation is not there, if the attitudes are not positive, then the learning can suffer from that. So creating stories, songs, engaging activities that keep the language not only alive in terms of input and exposure, but also in terms of motivation for a child to use it, it's definitely very good.
Okay, and we've got some questions from Alexander McMillan, who works as a paediatric speech and language therapist. He's got a few questions here. What are your views in relation to best practice supporting children with E2L? I'm not sure what E2L is. It might be a speech and language therapy term. Second language and expressive language differences.
Maybe English is a second language.
Okay, English is a second language and expressive language differences. Which language should be promoted, used at home, and which at school? So people who speak English as a second language and have expressive language differences.
Okay, I mean, I can just say very briefly that this is not my area of specialization. I have colleagues who work on this, and what I know from them and from the research, the literature, is that clearly cases have to be assessed, you know, individually. But from what we know globally, there is no evidence that speaking more than one language is necessarily a disadvantage if there is a condition of this kind. And there are various different kinds of conditions and different levels of severity. So we're working on autism, for example, we're working on specific language impairments, and it's not just one size fits for all, you know, there are different kinds of manifestations, levels, and so on. In general, the generalization is that speaking more than one language is not necessarily a problem. Although, you know, we clearly have to bear in mind that not all cases are the same. So there's no reason to think that bilingualism is disadvantageous in these conditions. But individual cases have to be looked at in their own rights.
Great. We've got one come in the chat from Dahlia. What's the best way to describe the difference between code switching and translanguaging?
Haha. Do you want a 2-hour answer? No, I'm joking. Well, translanguaging is a very broad term that includes, you know, I think what has been called, you know, code switching or code mixing, for example. You know, what's the difference between code switching and code mixing? I mean, essentially, it means, you know, going from one language to the other in communication. So in communication, using both languages to be communicative to the person you talk to. So clearly we can look at the details, you know, of translanguages, what it actually means, you know, and there's a lot of studies about the difference between, you know, mixing codes or switching from one code to the other when it happens. There are rules, you know, of code mixing and code switching that children learn very soon. So it's not a sign of confusion, but translanguages is a broader term term that includes many of these manifestations.
Great. Thomas, is there anything you want to add?
That continues the whole lifetime. So, I mean, there is a good reason why there is so much interest in this topic, because I think traditionally, the view of language for a long time was very static. So the idea was you learn a language when you are a child and that stays with you for the rest of your life. Now, this is not the way how we see it now, and it's very important also for the cognitive effects. Language is dynamic, it changes. Even, you know, we have one study that we look at the Western Isles of Scotland, people change the language use pattern very much after retirement, for a good reason, because then they start speaking much more, for instance, in Gaelic, because they don't have to switch always to English at work and so on. And I think so the important point here is that absolutely underlines the importance of looking at the real practice. And another term, by the way, that is very often used in this context is plurilingualism. So the idea, not just bilingualism or multilingualism, it can be, for instance, that people might feel more comfortable. That was something I suggested in one of the slides. Speaking about, let's say, emotions with their children or parents and family in one language, but then, for instance, doing a professional talk in the other. So it's not just about more or less, it can be also about different contexts.
Great. We're running out of time. Just to let everyone know that we will try and address all the remaining questions, and we'll publish them, and so that everybody can read the questions we don't get around to. We've got one more here from Patrick saying, is there anything known about the differences between being multilingual in languages in the same family, for example, Indo-European, as opposed to being multilingual in languages across different language families, like Indo-European, Semitic, Finno? Yeah? Thomas?
Yeah, as it happens, I mean, Antonella and I will have a meeting with a student in an hour where we are practically, PhD student, we are supervising, which works exactly on this topic. I think it's quite complex because what means similar? So we have to look, phonology is not the same as vocabulary, is not the same as grammar, and so on and so on. So that's one of the points. And secondly, it can go in both directions. So you could intuitively think the more different the language, the better, because then it gives you a kind of creative approach and, you know, changes your frame of mind and so on. But it could be exactly the opposite. If you have two languages that are very, very similar, then you have to control your output more, because it's much easier to get them confused. So you have, so to say, to concentrate more, to activate one and not the other. So from this point of view, this is really a fascinating topic, very much a topic of current research.
Yeah, Antonella, would you like to add anything about that?
Just to add that, yes, it can really go both ways from a cognitive point of view. Also because, you know, when you speak two similar languages, yes, I mean, on the one hand, you may have to, you know, invest more effort into, you know, keeping them separate and so on. On the other hand, it may not matter so much to keep them separate because you're more likely to be understood. You know, if the two languages are similar, you know, even if you mix them and so on, you are likely to be understood. So the motivation to keep them separate it can be reduced. So we need more research on the actual effects, but clearly there are multiple effects that don't always go in the same direction.
Okay, I think we're just about coming up on 4 o'clock now.
2 minutes, so maybe last question.
So Alexander, the pediatric speech and language therapist, also asked, how should parents with two different languages who are not proficient in the other speak with their children? So households where the parents are both speaking a different language. Antonella, do you want to jump in there?
Yes, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, you know, but if each parent speaks a different language, why not? I mean, they can each speak their language. That is a well-known system, you know, in the literature. It's called one parent, one language system. And, you know, does it work? Yes, it works. You know, it tends to change over time, you know, and particularly it's important that, you know, the parent who speaks the language the minority language that is not the language of the community is consistent in using that language because obviously, you know, that language is heard less compared to the language of the community. There are situations in which the parents speak two languages that are both different from the language of the community, and so the child becomes trilingual, right? And that is also possible. We have to have realistic expectations about this kind of situation. Again, we can't expect the child to be equally proficient in 3 languages because the levels may vary according to the situation, according to the exposure, according to motivation, and so on and so forth. But definitely the capacity, the ability to speak 3 languages will be there, and will be very good for the child.
Thanks. Thomas, is there anything you want to add about that one?
No, I think, you know, Antonella has summarized it. I mean, in a way, the situation, which in fact, I think some of us know quite well. And then the issue also is, again, very much what kind of Antonella mentioned, whether the languages are, for instance, so similar that people understand each other. So, for instance, I have friends where, you know, she is Brazilian, he is Italian, and the daughter speaks both languages and they understand each other. This will be different where the languages will be, let's say, Czech and Japanese. So I think there are a lot of variables which we have to take into account, and maybe that's a kind of closing word from me. I mean, yes, it is complicated, but you know, life is complicated. It's complicated in a fascinating way because we have to look at all the richness of languages, the relationship, and so on. We have to look at the social context, and that makes it such a fascinating topic that we love to study.
Great. Well, we'll pass back to Kat.
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions and the answers. We have a few unanswered questions, and as Christy mentioned, we will put them in the communication to you. We're going to basically take your names away and provide you with answers with the follow-up email from this seminar. You should also look out, we're going to have a new website launch sometime soon. COVID has a little bit disrupted our plans, but it will be up, and similar answers to questions will be available there as well. You will receive, after the seminar finishes, a short feedback survey, and we encourage you to respond to it and also tell us what you would like more. We've seen there was quite a few teachers here, quite a few Gaelic specific questions as well as SLT questions. So we'll take it into account and look out for our next seminars, which will be focusing much more specifically on health and speech and language issues, as well as heritage languages. So do keep an eye on our communication, and you can follow us either on social media via Facebook or Twitter. Christy and Putsi, if you could put in the chat area the contact details, but you will also receive them in the follow-up email. Maybe as well to bring your attention the next couple of weeks, we're going to be participating in Refugee Week, and we have 2 events coming up there where you can also join on via Zoom as well. So I suppose, unless Antonella and Thomas would like to add any sort of final words. Antonella, Thomas?
Well, no, I mean, just as I said, I mean, I will be, and I mean, I hope Christopher will retweet it. So if there are any useful links, I mean, what I find useful about Twitter are not necessarily the text, but the links that we can send so that you can access the information directly.
Exactly. So you can find Thomas on Twitter. And Antonella, any final comments from your side?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter. You can email me as well. And so communication channels are open. And we welcome any comments and questions and ways of working together. Thank you.
Fantastic. And on the chat area, you can also find there's been some links posted for parents and people involved in Gaelic medium education. If you want to have a look at what's prepared there for the parents and for children to maintain or develop Gaelic. And we will share these as well in a follow-up communication with you. So thank you very much for your participation. It's been a very new experience for us. It's a shame that we cannot see you, but thank you for interacting with us in all ways possible. And we wish you a lovely weekend. Hopefully the weather improves here in Edinburgh. And yes, I hope to see you again. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to end the meeting now for everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.